And I think that's something that we can take to heart too when we get in those situations. Don't fear, stand firm, and watch what God's going to do.
Right. Well, Steve, last time we said we were going to get to the part in Exodus where the people of Israel have reservations and wanted to go back to Israel. We didn't quite get there, but today we'll get to the point where Israel has reservations.
Are you positive?
I'm positive today we will get, at least Lord willing, we'll get to the passage where in Exodus now Israel is dealing with Moses and they're dealing with the reality of being in the wilderness. And they have some reservations and want to go back. So we'll be discussing that today on Reasoning Through the Bible. My name's Glenn, and this is Steve. And Steve, today it's another very interesting passage in the Word of God.
Yes, it is. And once again, we're going to see that God is doing all of this and orchestrating all of this in order to show his power, who he is, in order to protect Israel as they continue to go towards the promised land. I mean, this is just a wonderful thing to be able to look at this and see how God has put everything together. So it's going to be a good session today.
So if you have your Bibles, you may want to open them to Exodus chapter 14, and we'll be starting today in verse 5. And it says here, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart towards the people and said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made his chariot ready and took his people with him. And he took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he chased after the sons of Israel as the sons of Israel were going out boldly. Then the Egyptians chased after them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and they overtook them camping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord, and he said to Moses, "It is because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." So, Steve, we have here, again, the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt, and God did a series of 10 miracles, 10 plagues, if you will, and he brought them out, forced the hand of Pharaoh, and brought Israel out. And Israel has seen all of these miracles that God did.
Yeah.
And here they are. God, as we mentioned in our last program, God intentionally led them into a place where they were caught in between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. God intentionally led them there. And so Israel is now realizing this. They see the most formidable army in the world at the time coming towards them, and they're caught between this army and the sea. And they have these reservations. So what do you think was going through their minds?
Well, there's various archaeologists that are out there that have gone through speculation of exactly where the Red Sea was or where the Red Sea crossing was. And our listeners can go out and investigate that themselves and come up with their own conclusions regarding that. The thing is that last time we talked about, we know for sure it wasn't a swamp or a marshy area or anything else like that. And through some of the indications that we have here in regards to how many days, this was about 3 or 4 days after they had departed from Ramses where they were. We see over in Deuteronomy that the Egyptians were burying and mourning their dead. And so now if you'll look where they went first south, and then they kind of go back up north into this area that is probably there north of the Suez Gulf area. And God, what we're seeing is that God, there's other ways that God could have taken them to go out. This is a natural border area from the north of the Gulf of Suez there up to the Mediterranean Sea of the barrier, of the border of Egypt. They have outposts that are there. They have some natural lakes that are there that gave a barrier. But God is orchestrating this, and he's taking them directly in the southerly direction and then back up north again. And you can see here that Pharaoh is seeing, hey, these people are trying to get out of Egypt. They don't know exactly what they're doing and how to do it. The other thing is, it talks here, it says that whenever the Egyptian Pharaoh and the servants realized what they had done, because if you remember, every time Moses talked to them, it was, oh, let us go out for 3 days. Well, it's been after 3 days, and so now it's really kind of coming to home to Pharaoh, the realization that, hey, these people aren't coming back. And it says there in the text that when they realized that they had fled, Pharaoh now has an inclination that he needs to go out, and he's actually going to go and annihilate the Israelite nation.
And it says that here in verse 5, when Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart towards the people and say, well, what is this we've done?
Right.
And so remember what happened. There were 10 plagues. There was frogs and locusts and hail and darkness and taking of the firstborn son. And this entire series, Moses would command it to start and then command it to stop. It was very clear to Pharaoh that he was not fighting against a man, Moses. He was fighting against the God Yahweh,
right,
the God of Israel. And so he finally, after destroying the nation by being so obstinate, he here lets them go, and then as soon as the people go, they change their mind again.
Yeah.
And so I always try to apply these situations back to myself and the people around me. Do we ever get into a situation where we've seen God work and we've made a movement and a promise to obey God and then realize, wait a minute, maybe I should go back?
Well, yeah, and I think it is. I think that's somewhat of a human nature in regards to that. Pharaoh, though, his heart, we saw that he really didn't ever yield himself to Yahweh. He didn't really recognize Yahweh as being the one true God. And so we just continue to see Pharaoh's heart. We see Pharaoh's heart through here. God already knows what Pharaoh's heart is and what his inclination is. And yeah, it's just amazing. Like you said, the land of Egypt is destroyed. And here is Pharaoh. He's fixing to go out and still thinks that he's going to be able to go up against this God, Yahweh. And
Pharaoh's pattern here has been the same all the way through. God will put him in a painful circumstance, and he'll, by all means, let's get rid of this painful circumstance. But as soon as it's gone, he forgets. Yeah. And he goes right back to persecuting God and his people.
Yeah.
And so he makes what we would call today a foxhole conversion. Mm-hmm. You know, when all the horrible situations are piling down on top of us, we reach out to God.
And the artillery shells are coming in.
And there's all this, horribleness hitting us from every direction. We reach out to God. Well, as soon as God takes away the painful circumstance, then suddenly, okay, life back to normal.
Right.
And maybe I did this out of my own good strength, or maybe I was just lucky and I forget about God. Do Christians ever fall into that trap?
Every day. I think they do. And maybe it might take 2 or 3 of those type of experiences for them to realize that they should stick with what they have, commitments that they've made, and realization of what God has done for them.
We need to realize what God's done for us. And if we make a promise to God, we need to take that very seriously. So then in verse 6, he gathers chariots, which are war machines. These were the most high-tech war machines of the day. And he plans to attack Israel. And he intentionally, again, God intentionally placed Israel with its back to the sea, and he puts Pharaoh, the most formidable army in the world, with 600 chariots, are coming at them. In verse 9, it says there, Pharaoh's entire army has overtaken Israel. And I find, again, we had mentioned this in a previous program, sometimes God leads us into circumstances that, I'm in a spot here. But God has a purpose. He hasn't forgotten us. just because we're in a very scary circumstance doesn't mean that God's abandoned us, because God's going to do something great here.
Yeah, and we also see there in verse 6, it says, so he made his chariot ready, he being Pharaoh. What the text is actually saying is that Pharaoh didn't order for his chariot to be made ready. He was in such a state of mind that he went out himself and was hitching the horses together with the chariot and got his chariot ready. He was, as we'd say in East Texas, fit to be tied. Yes. And he was ready to go. And so we get this mindset of Pharaoh, what he's thinking and what type of mood that he is in. He's ready to go out there and take care of business.
Pharaoh must have thought that Israel's situation was hopeless.
Yeah, well,
militarily, he had all the advantages.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't you? I mean, you see them that they're backed up. I mean, it's a natural, hey, they can't get across the sea area, and I'm going to be in front of them. They have nowhere to go. And I've got these chariots, which are faster. I've got this army, which has instruments of war. They're just the people that are out there that have family and children and livestock and everything. It's going to be an easy win and an easy victory for me.
Does God ever lead his people, his children, into not just scary, but desperate circumstances? Because that's where they are. This is scary, but it's not just scary.
Right.
These are desperate circumstances.
Yeah, and I think there's in this particular case, there's two purposes. One is he's gonna wipe out the Egyptian army. And think about it. If he doesn't wipe out the Egyptian army and all of these people that go across, upwards of 2 million people go across, as they cross that Sinai Peninsula going to the land of Canaan, they would always be under threat of having Pharaoh come after them in their rear as they go across that desert area. Well, God has taken care of that. He's taken that out completely, and he's going to wipe out the Egyptian army. So that's the first thing. The second thing is he's leading them there to show, once again, Israel, that he does have their back and that he is going to take care of them and what he can do and what he can do it as well. So when you asked, does God lead us in the areas of danger sometimes or predicaments? I think so. But it's always in order for him to show us, I think, that he does have our back and he has our best interest at heart. And if we'll just trust in him, that we'll be able to see his work and his glory.
I think that's the key, is he leads us into circumstances where there's no way that we could get the glory.
Right.
That it has to be deliverance from him. Remember Gideon had 30,000 men? Well, that's too many.
Yeah.
Gets it down to 300 and just completely hopeless militarily. Well, God works through that.
Right.
And I think that's what we have here, is that God puts them in a circumstance where the only way out of this is for God to deliver them.
Right.
And I think he puts us in those circumstances too.
Yeah.
Let's also look down at the middle of verse 10. If you look at verse 10, it tells us something about how Israel is thinking. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and so they could see the Egyptians. The Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. And so they cried out to the Lord. They became very frightened.
Yeah.
So at this point, Israel is not just frightened, but very frightened. Mm-hmm. And so, Steve, at this point, has God given Israel any reason why they would be able to trust him?
Well, yes. Through some of the plagues.
Like maybe 10 of the plagues?
Yeah, 10 of the plagues. And with some of them, if not all of them, their land of Goshen where they were at was protected from those plagues, and especially the very last one. But, again, there's women and children that are here. These aren't just the men like a fighting force. There's women and children. These are families. So you can kind of see where naturally there would be some fright that would be taking place when you see this great dust from an army that's coming forth.
So people of Israel saw these 10 miracles, these 10 grand plagues that came through Moses and Aaron to Pharaoh and the people of Egypt. And they saw God start them. They saw God finish them. Even before that, they saw the miracles of Moses' hand being leprous. They saw the staff turn into a snake. They saw all these miracles, and at each time, God had protected them. The last half of the plagues, God protected Israel specifically and put the plagues on Egypt. So over and over again, for a long period of time, God had given them evidence that he would protect them. And then God leads them into this circumstance where their back's against the sea and the army's coming and they're afraid.
Right.
And so I submit they had plenty of evidence why they shouldn't have been afraid. So easy to point fingers at Israel.
Right.
Do we have plenty of evidence to show us that God has protected us over the years and he's with us? And so that when we get in a scary circumstance, do we have justification to be frightened, or should we trust God?
Well, yes, we have had evidence, and I know that still, when you get in those type of situations, you sometimes you're trusting God, but yet you're still praying out and praying to Him in order to protect you. So sometimes I don't think it's necessarily that you doubt God, but you are fervently praying that He is going to deliver you from whatever the circumstance might be.
Why don't we trust Him more? Because all of us have seen God work in our lives.
Yeah.
And we get into scary circumstances. Why don't we trust Him more? And we're all guilty of that.
I think it's just human nature.
So then look at verse 12. What would cause the Jewish people to tell Moses that it would have been better for them to stay in Egypt as slaves than to die in the wilderness? Why would they go as far as to say, oh, we should, it was better for us to be back in Egypt? Why in the world would they say that at this point?
Again, human nature. I think that people are the same yesterday that they are today. It's safety, right? They think that even though that they were going to be in servitude and bondage serving Egypt, they look at that as being a safe place. And they're looking at the now. You know, again, God also knows where they're going. He's taking them to this land of milk and honey. He knows what's laying ahead of them. They're looking at the immediately now. And that could be one reason why that we don't trust God sometimes. We're living in the now, and we look at the situation now and don't realize, hey, there's something that's going to progress here, and what's going to happen in the future, if I trusted God to take care of it, is something that's going to be better in the long run.
And that's what I had put my finger on as well. They were looking at the immediate circumstances, which were indeed scary. I mean, no doubt about it. It was scary circumstances. But that doesn't mean they should be afraid, because they had seen plenty of times God work. They were looking, as you said, at the now. They were looking at the immediate circumstance, and the fear had clouded their memory and clouded their judgment of the long-term vision of what God might have been doing. Of course, they hadn't read the end of the book yet, so they were in this very frightful circumstance, but they had seen God work, and the scary circumstance had clouded their vision of seeing God's grand hand in this. And I submit this happens to people all the time. We get cancer. We get in scary circumstances with us and our family. We get into job situations, and we get so worried about the immediate circumstance that is indeed scary that we lose track of maybe God's moving us in a specific direction. Remember, God put them here intentionally.
Right.
So next we have here the Jews here are being at least afraid of being killed by Pharaoh. And one question I would ask, Steve, are there things in life that's worse than dying? Are there things in life that's worse than dying? Because that's one of our great fears. But if we know that the Lord's with us, are there things worse than dying?
Well, whenever you're in a difficult situation and what you've done, facing consequences maybe of what you've done or something like that, it can seem that, yes, it is worse than dying. You know, some people actually say, I'd rather be dead to get me out of this situation, which is really kind of not the right way to look at things, but sometimes it gets that way.
So when Israel were slaves in Egypt, they didn't have the protections of the Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law, when we get later in the book, we'll see how God had set instructions on how to deal with servants, how to deal with slaves, and he protected them from being abused. But Egypt didn't have that.
No.
They were very severely abusing Israel as slaves. And here they are, they get in this scary circumstance. They said, oh, it would have been better if we were back in Egypt. And really, no, it wouldn't. They were the ones crying out to God saying, deliver us from this. And so they seem to be very focused on the immediate circumstances again and not seeing God's grand plan.
And we know, don't we just know that that would be the case? If they would have thrown the white flag up on their own and gone back, we can almost visualize 40 years down the road, they're crying out to God once again, hey, you need to deliver us from this situation that we're in.
So look at verse 12. If we look at verse 12, these are the people grumbling back against Moses, and they're basically blaming Moses. Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt? In other words, we told you so, is really what they're saying, leave us alone that we can serve the Egyptians. And so they're now blaming Moses for getting them in this circumstances. Was it Moses' responsibility of why they are here? I mean, who was really moving them in that spot?
Yeah, God was. And so no. And a little bit later, we'll see that Moses says, hey, you're not grumbling against me, you're grumbling against God. And so, you know, but no, it's not Moses, it's God that's taking them there.
So now we have, put yourselves in the shoes of poor Moses here. Remember back at the burning bush, Moses didn't want this job. He talked 6 or 8 times saying, God, pick somebody else.
Right.
You picked the wrong guy.
Right.
And God says, no.
Yeah.
I pick, you're the one I want.
Yeah.
And so Moses was basically shoehorned into this position because of God. Yeah. And now the people are grumbling. The whole congregation is blaming Moses for this when Moses was just doing what he was told.
Yeah, congratulations, Moses, for being in that position. But I do think that does highlight, though, they're looking at Moses as doing this, leading them out versus God. So the ones grumbling, that's what they're doing is they're saying, Moses, you're the one that let us out. You're the one, we told you that we didn't need to go. You're the one, but you insisted that we go. And so they're looking at the person rather than looking at God. And so if you look at God and understand, no, wait a minute, it's not Moses that has led us here. It's God that has led us here. And we need to have our trust in him. That's a huge difference between looking at the human being versus looking at the at God. You know, it kind of brings to mind as far as maybe a situation where a church decides to move to a new piece of property and they all get behind the vision of it and they all vote for it. And they get over to the new piece of property and maybe they get themselves in a little bit of debt. And all of a sudden, the people that voted 100% to make the move and to make the building committee and all of that stuff and to purchase the property, all of a sudden there's grumbling that takes place of going like, what are we doing over here and all this debt? And we should have stayed where we were. Well, the vision that they had and that they voted for, that God was leading them to go to a different place so that they could minister in a greater capacity to the community. Now, all of a sudden, hey, this wasn't the right thing to do. So it's on a small scale in regards to what's going on here, but it's something that is very real. People will have a vision. They will vote, yes, we need to do this because God is taking us there. But at some sort of a little bit of pushback or complication or something, all of a sudden, no, this pastor led us here, or the building committee led us here, or the deacons led us here. All of a sudden, the focus goes back on the people and the human aspect of it, and they forget about that. No, God is the one that you said was putting it on your heart to make that move.
Should a pastor or a church leader expect the congregation to, at least at times, to turn on them and blame them? The pastor, again, oftentimes just trying, God, where do you want this flock to go? And just trying to follow God and doing their best to do what God guides them to do. And the congregation turns and blames the pastor. Should a pastor expect that to happen?
I think so. At some point in time in his pastorship, I think that something like that is most likely could happen, yes.
And I would say both to our pastors out there that listen to our program, expect that you will not be able to please everybody in the congregation. Sooner or later, they're going to blame you for merely trying to follow God. And to the congregation that are grumbling against their pastor, there's too many congregations go to church on Sunday morning and then come home and have roast preacher for lunch. And so the pastor oftentimes just trying to follow God, just trying to lead where God's leading them. And so don't blame the pastor every time there's a scary circumstance.
Right.
And so I see this a lot. So how should church leaders react when the congregation turns on them?
I think the same thing of what Moses is going to tell them. Hey, you need to remember that this was God leading us to this place, whatever the situation might be, and we need to focus them back on God. That's what they need to do. They need to focus them back on God and what the situation was, and so that they're not looking at the human aspect of it, but saying, we placed our faith and trust that this was the right thing to do. We need to let God make it happen. We need to let God carry through with it, and we need to keep our faith in God.
So the way I would describe it, Steve, is the pastors are shepherds, and the shepherds are there to lead the sheep, not follow the sheep. The shepherds are there to lead the sheep, not follow the sheep. If the sheep want to go one direction, and the shepherd knows that they need to go a different direction, then lead the sheep. Don't follow the sheep. That's kind of backwards. And so to our shepherds out there, learn to lead the sheep, not follow the sheep. And so church leaders often get into these bad circumstances. And so, Steve, if you could start at verse 13 and read down to verse 18.
But Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. As you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. As for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I am honored through Pharaoh, through his chariots and his horsemen.
Okay, so with this, remember where Israel was. Their backs are up against the sea, and the greatest military force in the world at the time is in front of them. They're in a spot. But they had seen all these miracles up to now from God, so they should have had fairly confidence. But from a just purely natural perspective, is there a way out of this problem?
No. There's no way for them to get across this sea area, and there's no way that they can go back and they don't have a fighting force that can go up against this Egyptian army.
So from a natural perspective, it was impossible.
Right.
Was it possible with God?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
well, he knew exactly what he was doing, yes.
And look at verse 15. I find it interesting here in verse 15. God's tone there was almost like, okay, how come you're not trusting me? Right? The Lord said, why are you crying out to me? Tell Israel to move forward.
Right.
So God was saying to them, why are you complaining? Why are you afraid?
Right.
Tell them to move. And so I think that lesson applies to us today. God will often lead us into not just scary, but desperate circumstances, and then say, why are you crying out to me? Move forward. Because he has shown us so many times in the past that he's trustworthy, and there's a way out of this, and there's a more grand purpose than just us. Because all these people back here in Exodus, he put them in a scary circumstance, but it was for a reason. God had this grand plan of using this salvation in here in Exodus as a type of the Lord Jesus Christ. And of course, no way they could have seen that.
Right.
But they should have trusted God and said, okay, I don't know why God's doing this, but he must have a grand purpose.
Yes.
And so that's what I see in this. And then in verse 16, Moses uses his staff to divide the sea. And in 17, God says he will strengthen Pharaoh's heart. We talked about in the past, it means to harden just means to strengthen. And then God says, I will be honored. That's really what he's saying here.
Right.
God is saying, I will be honored in this. He insists on getting the recognition that he deserves. God is not going to be put in second place. He insists on being the first because he is the first and the best. He is worthy, and so it is not a crime for him to demand worship and respect and worthiness. And I think that's the tone coming out of here. Don't you think, Steve?
Absolutely. And if you go back to the first part of 12, whenever the people are complaining to Moses, hey, what have you done? Moses, the first thing he tells him, he says, do not fear. And I think this is things that we can apply to our lives whenever we get into these situations that we were talking about before, where we are in a situation where all of a sudden we're fearful and want to go back to where we were. The first thing Moses tells him is, don't fear. The second thing he says, take your stand. In other words, stand firm. And then to see with your eyes, that they're going to see with their eyes that day, the salvation, the deliverance, the help, the victory that God or Yahweh is going to bring to a completeness. He's going to accomplish for them. He's going to perform an activity with a distinct purpose. And I think that's something that we can take to heart too when we get in those situations. Don't fear, stand firm, and watch what God's going to do.
Right. God has a purpose. We may not see it, and he may not even tell us, but he has a purpose. He doesn't do things randomly. Yeah. He does things with a grand purpose. All of his actions here in the Bible, both Old Testament, New, all work towards a grand plan that he has, and we get the privilege of being part of that. And he doesn't always tell us what the end goal is here, but everything we have seen in the past from God tells us that he does have a grand plan, a grand purpose, and we get the privilege of being part of it, even though we don't really understand. And I think that's just wonderful. Yep. And so probably a good time to pause for now. And we're still in the midst of this story. We're going to see actually how it resolves next time as we continue to reason through the Bible, and we trust that you'll be here to do that with us as well.
Thank you for watching and listening, and may God bless you.